It was right around this time a few years ago when I marched on our state capitol, inspired by some youth climate activists. And I came back home to experience an aha moment. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Rhonda Bannard, and I'm the founder and executive director of Earth Gives and Earth Gives Day. And this is what that aha moment turned into: the first US-wide Giving Day focused solely on environmental, climate, and climate justice nonprofits. Because when I did the research and found out that only 2% of philanthropy goes to the work of these organizations, I thought that I needed to do something. And so the idea is to be able to speed up and scale the work of eco nonprofits who have already had their boots on the ground and boats in the ocean and studied the issues and are doing the work. So tonight is part of what we want to also advance, and that is learning and insight, building a community who learns together, gets smarter, and is able to take action in a variety of ways. And as you well know, there are marches that are going to be taking place again this weekend across the globe, marching on reducing fossil fuels and getting rid of fossil fuels. So all of you tonight are part of blazing a trail for the work to shape a caring and connected community that's taking action on the most consequential issue of our time. So let's dig in. We're going to have a welcoming guest, our featured program presenter, time for Q&A, and a few key messages and short breakouts for you to get to share what you've learned and what you plan to do. So special thanks first to Gabe from the University of Cincinnati. He's also with Net Impact, and he's going to lead one of the breakout sessions. And then another that I'm about to hand things off to. What is that, Gabe? You're showing off your book?
No, it's not mine, but it's one that I picked up yesterday at this Conscious Capitalism Summit, Radical Business by David Gaines. So far, it's a good read. You can find it on Amazon, so I guess I recommend it, whatever that means. I don't really have much authority, but...
Great. And thanks for being a leader at your Net Impact chapter. And another one that I get to hand off to, we have a Rutgers student in the house.
Hello.
She is a junior. She is an EcoAthlete. And she's a double major in environmental studies and poli-sci. Her interests include Indigenous rights, conservation, land protection, and advocacy. And now I'm going to turn it over to her. So please welcome Hale Oal. Hale.
Thank you, Rhonda. All right, my name is Hale Oal. I'm a junior at Rutgers University, and I'm studying political science and environmental studies. And like Rhonda said, some of my main passions and interests are Indigenous rights, conservation, and land policy. So EcoAthletes is a really cool program founded by Lou Blostein. It allows athletes at the collegiate and the pro level to use their platforms to talk about the climate change and the climate comeback. And Lou has taught us about different ways that climate change specifically impacts college students. So I use my platforms to talk about climate change, some things we can do to be more conscious as students and especially student athletes. And one thing specifically that we really focus on at EcoAthletes with specifically collegiate athletes is the use of gear and the waste with clothing. So that's one thing that I've been really focusing on a lot lately, is being more conscious about, recycling clothing, reusing clothing. It's just so much better for the environment, and it uses a lot less water for sure to be reusing all that. So I really became involved in EcoAthletes last year, but my passion for environmental science and studies went way back. So I am half Turkish, and I grew up on the Aegean coast, and I'm very familiar with marine life and scuba diving, and it's always been a passion of mine. And I believe around 2018 is when I started seeing the real effects of the climate change in the Aegean Sea. And this was mainly in biodiversity loss and change in marine diversity. And I knew I couldn't just sit back and watch it all happen. So I decided to go obviously in school the route of political science and environmental studies, but also join EcoAthletes to kind of get to learn more about how I can use my voice to advocate for that disaster, and obviously study and monitor it on my own. Because it's in Turkey, it's a little bit more difficult to, advocate for it over there. I'm not 100% fluent, but, at least being able to use my voice and to show, real pictures of, hey, this is what's going on in, our oceans and our planet. And, the other day we were just there about a month ago, and we picked up 50 pounds of plastic in about an hour and a half. So it really just goes to show how much environmental degradation really does involve and impact not only land, but in the water as well. So I'm really looking forward to continuing with EcoAthletes and being able to use my platform to advocate for it as well. And we were recently, me and 3 other Rutgers athletes were part of the first NIL name, image, and likeness deal that focuses on climate change, which is really unique. So we will be traveling to local high schools and middle schools in the fall and explain, a little bit about climate change and why we should care as young people and take the opportunity to, put matters in our own hands. So hopefully this paves the way for other athletes to use their platform as well. And yeah, thank you so much. It really was a privilege to talk. And without further ado, I would like to give the introduction to our next guest. Please meet Suzanne Jones, also fondly named as Zan. She has more than 30 years of experience and expertise in environmental and climate policy, both in the nonprofit and the government. She currently is in her 9th year as executive director of EcoCycle based in Boulder County.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And I am totally impressed by what you're doing with EcoAthletes. So let me jump right in to sharing my screen. I've been tasked with talking about recycling and other zero waste solutions and circularity. And I think the screen is working. Okay. If you are like me, you are hearing some discouraging and confusing news these days. I get lots and lots of questions about, hey, is recycling real? Is the stuff in my bin really getting recycled? Or is it just a corporate scam? And, a lot of disbelief that the system's working and that circularity is anything more than this sort of fantastical notion rather than a possibility. So I'm here tonight to shed some light on that and to let you know that circularity is really important, it matters, and we can make real progress towards it. But first, let me just tell you a little bit about EcoCycle. We are one of the oldest and largest nonprofit recyclers in the country. We're a leader in the zero waste movement. We've been around since 1976. Our mission is to innovate, implement, and then advocate for zero waste solutions to foster a more regenerative, equitable, and climate resilient future. And we do that by engaging in just about every aspect of zero waste. We operate the Boulder County Single Stream Recycling Center. We founded the first of its kind ever hard to recycle material yard with the city of Boulder that we still operate. We have a fleet of trucks that we haul composting and recycling with to help businesses become more sustainable. We teach in all the public schools in our region. We work with communities across Colorado, helping them move up the zero waste ladder. And we also, we go down to the state legislature and try to pass policy in service of rising the tide for all boats. So let me talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing now to advance circularity. Let's start with where we're at right now, which is the current system. It's a linear model. It's where we take resources, we make products, and then we throw them out when we're done with them, usually burying these resources in the ground or incinerating them. It's actually an incredibly wasteful, stupid system. It's a dead-end street. In Colorado, where I live, it's estimated that we bury about $100 million worth of valuable materials in landfills every year. Nothing epitomizes this more than this take, make, waste system, more than our addiction to single-use disposables. It blows my mind when I think that 36% of plastic production is simply for single-use disposable packaging, where we use non-renewable resources to make something that we use for just minutes. In contrast, a circular economy is where resources are continuously cycled through the system, like what we see in nature. It's a system where it's actually designed to prevent pollution in the first place, to circulate these materials at their highest value by doing things like repair and reuse and refurbishing, and then recycling and composting and remanufacturing to keep those materials in the circulation. And the result is that we regenerate nature. We're not degrading and polluting and using it up. Here's another image of that. And you can see the red part is upstream. That's before consumption. That's where we need to really minimize the resources we use to make stuff. The purple is that circulation, where we're trying to use and cycle resources as much as possible. And at the end, downstream, that's when we collect those materials, recycle them, and get them back into circulation. So that's what we're after. An example of this is composting, right? It mimics nature in a beautiful way. Nature doesn't have waste, right? So, you eat an apple core, you put it in your compost bin, it gets made into compost, which is this valuable soil amendment, which is applied to farmers' fields, and they grow the crops that end up back on your table. So that's circularity. It's important to remember, though, that even with the circular system, we still have to reduce consumption because we live on a finite planet. So you'll notice at the top of this hierarchy, reduce is number one, most important thing we can do. Then comes you get down to reuse. And then finally, recycling is at the bottom. It's part of the solution. It's an important part, but it's certainly not the first and most important thing we need to do. So that's circularity, but why is this important? There's a lot of reasons, but I will sort of condense them into three: equity, finite resources, and climate. So let's just talk about equity for a second. We know that consumption and the production of stuff has inequitable impacts on frontline communities, and in particular, communities of color, low-income neighborhoods. They're more likely to be living near landfills, refineries, plastic production facilities, and bearing a disproportionate impact of health and safety concerns that comes from that. These facilities aren't often in more privileged, usually white neighborhoods, who are often the ones driving the consumption. So, and we'll note that around the world, a lot of the resources we need for cell phones and laptops and cars, they come from other countries where indigenous cultures and peoples are being pushed, off those lands because of resource extraction. And so making the most of those resources is really important to addressing inequities. The second major reason is finite resources. We need to transition to circularity because right now we are consuming at an unsustainable rate. And Americans are driving that. We only make up 5% of the population, and yet we have twice the consumption rate of other developed countries, for example, and we make a huge percentage of global waste. It is estimated that if everyone used our consumption rate, that we'd need 5 planets in order to support the human population. And then finally, we need circularity because it's an essential element of addressing climate. The EPA tells us that 42% of the climate footprint in the United States comes from our stuff and our food. So how we make it, haul it, transport it, use it, and then get rid of it. So it's also often referred to as consumption emissions. And our throwaway economy has really fueled a huge increase in global carbon emissions since 1970. So how we manage materials and our use of them and our consumption is hugely important for climate. So I think it's worth drilling down on this a little bit more because a lot of people don't understand this close connection. Zero waste, like recycling and composting, saves energy because every time you make new materials out of old materials, you save a whole lot of energy, and it's a significant amount. Secondly, when you put biodegradable materials like paper, grass clippings, food scraps into landfill, it gets buried without oxygen, it rots, it produces methane, which is an incredibly potent greenhouse gas. So in order to avoid that, we need to do zero waste stuff, including composting, which is the third reason. If we take, instead of putting those materials in landfills, instead we compost and apply that compost to soil, we end up enriching the soils and growing plants that are able to suck down more through photosynthesis to draw more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, store it in the soil. So it's actually a nature-based climate solution that can help us reverse some of the damage we've already done. So these savings are significant. This graph, I just want to show you that by material, how much energy is saved when you use, say, an old aluminum can to make a new one, as opposed to going to mine more bauxite ore in a rainforest to make more aluminum. So it's significant. So never throw away another aluminum can in your life. Not that any of you would, but it's important to realize just how important a solution this is. So that's what circularity is, why it's important. So what can we do about it? And frankly, we've got to tackle this from all angles, both at the individual level and choices we make, which we'll talk about later, but even more importantly, at the systemic level. We've got to make changes at all levels, local, state, national, global, to really fundamentally change how we live on this planet. And we need to do that by really doubling down on reduce, reuse, and then recycling. So how are we going to reduce? A fundamental system change we need to do is to reduce our fossil fuel use, in particular by stopping the production and use of unnecessary plastics. You may know that as the oil and gas falls out of favor as a fuel source, because we're making progress on renewable energy and electrifying buildings and cars, the intention of the industry is to quadruple production of plastics. To pivot to plastics is a way to retain their market share. It's really alarming and scary, and we can't allow it to happen. So what do we do about that? There's a lot of things going on to try to get at this problem. One of those is happening at the national level. There is a dialogue at the U.S. by the U.S. Plastic Pact, which is a consortium of more than 100 businesses, non-for-profits, academics, governments, working together to move towards a circular economy. And it includes a lot of the major brands like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Unilever, all across the plastic supply chain. And recently, the U.S. Pact came out after a long, heated dialogue with a list of 11 plastics that the Pact agrees should be eliminated by 2025. So these are resins and products, plastic resins and products that are not currently recyclable and aren't likely to become so anytime soon, if at all, ever, and are also either toxic, unnecessary, interfere with recycling generally because of lookalikes, that sort of thing. And so this is a pretty impressive list. And it's the first time the big brands have sort of taken responsibility for the plastic products they're putting out there. But so far, it's just voluntary. So it's an important step, but what can we do that's more binding? One of the things we can do is to ban single-use disposables. And here in Colorado, we recently passed the Plastic Pollution Reduction Act, which is going to go into effect in January. And it's going to ban single-use plastic bags for grocery stores and major retailers. It's also going to ban food and drink polystyrene containers, also known as styrofoam. And importantly, it also removed the plastic preemption. We had a state level law that prevented communities from regulating plastic. Well, we got rid of that. So now all communities in Colorado can go any farther. But this is an important step in just getting rid of the stuff we don't need that's made out of fossil fuels. But if we're going to ban things, we also need to come up with alternatives. And this is an example of something EcoCycle did. It's a guide to help restaurants and food establishments pivot to alternatives. If they can't use polystyrene, what are they going to do? And so we provided this to really help them navigate those choices, because addressing systematic change through procurement policies is also a powerful thing. And this is a page from that guide that just shows how it's set up. It goes from best choices to worst choices. And it shows the options, and it also gives the environmental costs and the actual financial costs. You'll note that reusables on the left there end up being the best option again and again. That is also a systemic change that we need to make, which is how do we scale up reusables? And there's a group called Upstream that I would direct you toward that does really good work on this. This graph compares cups made out of different materials. Reusables are the ones in blue, compared to single-use disposables. And the assumption being made there is if you use say a glass 500 times, what does a single use of that glass compare to a single use of a disposable? And it's really amazing results that they have come up with. I invite you to go look at their website. But it shows that reusables, they have a break-even point after which they are the best choice, and benefits accrue every time that you use beyond that. And that break-even point is anywhere from 2 to 122 times. And there's some, materials like steel and glass and ceramic that can be used thousands of times. So that's an example of something that we need to scale in many more places. One example of that is refilling. Single-use water bottles are a real important thing that we need to get rid of in our lives. And having refillable stations all over airports, schools, and increasingly, this is an example from 2 tourist towns in Colorado, where not only do they have these stations, but they're advertising them so that tourists don't need to bring all their waste with them when they come to visit. Another example of how we can really propel reuse and reduce is the right to repair movement, which is an international effort to secure the ability to repair the products that you buy and to prevent the companies from limiting your ability to do so. And the concept is if you buy something, you own it, you should be able to repair it however and whenever and with whoever you'd like. And so the goal of the movement is to remove those barriers. And I'll just note, for example, New York just recently passed a broad electronics right to repair bill. So now that New Yorkers can have access to the parts, the software, and the documentation to actually repair their phones, for example. Here in Colorado, we just passed a right to repair law for wheelchairs, and then more recently for ag equipment. And this is part of a national trend. This is a map just from 2023. It shows where 54 bills in 28 states have been introduced to address everything from cars to electronics to appliances, etc. But the last thing, reduce, reuse, recycle, I wanted to just talk for a few minutes about how we need to also reform recycling. But in order to do that, I wanted to set the record straight on a few things because we hear a lot of confusing things, like I mentioned at the beginning, about recycling. And since we're recyclers, wanted to help shed some light on that. And I think the important thing to note is that recycling is not the same as recycling plastics. And the debate is really about recycling plastics. The rest of recycling works really well. So let's talk a little bit about recycling plastics. When we are able to recycle plastics, it's worth noting it does reduce the need to use fossil fuels to make more plastics, and that's a good thing. And it's an important, and there are robust markets for certain types of plastics, 1s and 2s and 5s, if that means anything to you. Those are the most collected recyclables, and they're the least toxic, and they have end markets. These are things like PET bottles, HDPE jugs, and in some places polypropylene. So that is working, and we need to continue to take advantage of that. What doesn't work, was never designed to work, is a lot of other plastics like 3s, 6s, and 7s and black plastics. It's really confusing that there's a little chasing arrow symbol with a number in it on all plastics. All it does is tell you the resin code. It doesn't mean it's recyclable. And most plastic packaging isn't. And then finally, I'll note that the confusion about all this and the public distrust of what plastic companies are doing is really getting in the way of real recycling. And just to keep in mind that 90% of what gets recycled is valuable glass, metal, paper, cardboard, and we need to continue doing that for the planet. But let's be clear, recycling is not the answer, it's just part of the answer. We need to continue to reduce and reuse and get rid of problematic plastics. EcoCycle is a part of a coalition of other community-based, mission-based recyclers in the country. It's called the Alliance of Mission-Based Recyclers, or AMBER. And we have come together to try to really clarify what's real recycling and to promote authentic real recycling, to call foul on any corporate greenwashing about plastics that aren't really recyclable, and to push for better policies. And also note, if you go to that website, there's a great film that we recently put out called Chasing Arrows, that talks a lot about these myths and what the important and appropriate role of recycling. Some of these policies that we're pushing for that are transformative to really change the system, one of them is called extended producer responsibility. And it's something that really turns the system on its head. And what it does is it's a change where the consumer brands that make the boxes and the bottles and all of that packaging, that they become responsible for the end of life cycle for those products that they sell, and they pay to recycle them. And so instead of you and I paying for it, or our local government paying for it, the brands pay for it. And the other important part of it is they pay for a system that everyone can participate in. So if you live in the rural areas, you would have recycling services. If you live in an apartment building, you'd get recycling services. So it really shifts the responsibility to the brands. Typically, it's industry run, but has government oversight and stakeholder input. And there is a lot of benefits to it. These are some of them. I will note that it also helps with a common list of recyclables that is consistent statewide. And it also helps for remanufacturing, because then you have a reliable source of materials that you can count on. Colorado was recently the third state in the country to pass EPR. We're very proud of that. EcoCycle played a big role in that. And now we're working hard to get it implemented. I'll note that EPR has been in place in the European Union for over a decade and is also in place in Canada. So we know it works. And that's the kind of system change we need to see. Here are some other policy changes that we're pushing. One is truth in labeling, because there's a lot of confusion about that. Another is to drive the end markets by requiring minimum recycled content in new products. And the other is to make darn sure that plastics to fuel, where you're burning plastics, that isn't allowed to be called recycling, and that we end that as much as possible. Again, that's more linear. That's not circularity. So those are some of the systemic changes that we are pushing. Let's just talk a few more minutes about what you can do as an individual. It goes without saying that we should all be reducing, reusing, and recycling and composting in our daily life. But there's also a lot of other eco-living practices and choices that prevent waste, support green economies, that create healthier homes and communities that we should be embracing. And a lot of that, of creating this more sustainable future, it's about reimagining and rethinking our relationship to the planet, and also to our stuff. So that involves things like supporting reuse alternatives, and not feeling you have to own things. You can, just like you go to the library and rent a book, you can rent equipment that you need to use once a year to, say, rototill your garden. You can share that with others. Here's something on our website, which is just a tour of thrift stores and reuse libraries in Boulder County. We should also embrace reuse alternatives. There's more and more companies and municipalities that are trying to figure out, how do we make takeout food reusable? How do we figure out that system? Around here, Deliver Zero and Our Cup are two of the options that are trying to get airborne, and they need individuals like all of us to help make them viable. The other key part is to be informed. You need to be an informed consumer. Every day you vote with your dollars. And yeah, it's complicated, but if you can figure out a cell phone, you can figure out plastics, for example. And and to make better choices. If you have to buy plastics, you should know which ones are better and which ones are worse. And this is an example of a guide on our website to help people do that. The other thing, though, and I think this is my last slide, is that as an individual, you are incredibly important in a democracy. You are the fuel that drives system change. So in addition to making thoughtful lifestyle choices, we need everybody to get engaged with educating your family, your friends, your schoolmates, your coworkers, to really inform and spread the word about the importance of circularity. We need, to help volunteer at nonprofits that are trying to make that change. We need you to be involved in the political process. We need to elect leaders that are informed and committed to change. Heck, you should run for office yourself. I got to put a plug in for that. I was one of those people that did that, and I recommend it highly. And we need everybody to take responsibility for the future. And I love this quote by Alice Walker, that activism is our rent for living on this planet. So I'm going to end there. I really can't thank you enough for being here, for caring enough about the planet to listen in. And I invite you, if you're not already, to get more deeply engaged in this effort to build a more sustainable and equitable future. Thank you so much. Please consider us a resource to call on. There's a lot of great stuff on our website, and a lot of our partners we reference on our website. So there's a lot of resources to help us in this journey.
Thank you, Zan. Wow, that was amazing. I learned so much. I want to open it up for questions from anybody from the audience who's here that might want to ask you a question. Maybe this got missed from your intro, but you did serve as mayor of Boulder and was on the city council. So the intersection into advocacy and creating policy was key in some of your work. So I guess anyone's got some questions, open up your mic. And Gabe, go ahead.
Yeah, so it may be obvious, maybe not obvious. In a town or city like Boulder, it might be a little bit easier to get people to come around to things like sustainability and supply chain management and recycling. What do you recommend for areas that don't necessarily have as progressive of thought as like an average? How do you deal with large communities that don't want to recycle and don't really care, no matter what?
That is a great question. And you're right. It is easier when you're in a place where people are leaning into the solutions and are predisposed to them. But I'll note that, and I don't want to be too political in the Democratic Republican sort of way, but I'll note that Colorado used to be a red state not that long ago. When I first moved here 20 years ago, and it has evolved in part because of lots of people participating in the process. So where do you start if you don't have that? There's a lot of arguments for circularity that depend on economics. That waste not, want not used to be how our grandparents lived, right? And that made good economic sense. It still does. So waste is an efficiency in the system, right? So I do believe working from where people are at in terms of those sorts of arguments, making lots of trash that you have to pay to get thrown away is not a good business plan. Reusables, actually, for example, there's a great argument to be made for saving money, even when you take into account rewashing them. There's a good body of work. So I guess that's one place I would start, is those kinds of arguments. I also think that a lot of these movements, like these plastic bag bans that are happening across the country, are student-led movements. They are led by young people who understand what's at stake and care deeply about the future. And I think sometimes that's what carried the day. I know as a city council member, when a bunch of students came to talk to us, we wanted to be responsive. And I think that regardless of political persuasions, most people care about the next generation and want to do right by them. So I think there's not an easy answer to your question, but those are some of the ways to get at it. And I'm sure other people on this call have some other ideas.
Hale, you had a question?
Yeah, I do. So this is a little bit more specific, I guess, to reusing plastic. I'm not sure if this is something you specialize in, but I know that a lot of bigger brands, and specifically this brand in Massachusetts, are using recycled plastic bottles to make clothing now. And it's becoming definitely a lot more popular as, you know, plastic pollution awareness is spreading. But there are some studies now that are coming out that it might not be as ecologically friendly as they thought, because when these clothings are washed, these small micro and nanoplastics are being basically emitted back into waterways. And I know that there's still a lot more research that needs to be done in that field, but I just wanted to know kind of your opinion on that, if you think that that is really helpful or if it is something that might not be as beneficial as we once thought.
Another good question. I think microplastics, and I think everybody knows the plastics don't go away. They just break down into smaller and smaller pieces, and now they're finding them in our bloodstream. Yeah, they're everywhere. And you raise a really good concern. When we take like plastic bottles and we make them into a, you know, a jacket, that's recycled once, and then eventually this, unless you're Patagonia and take it back, it goes eventually. It's recycling once. So we're downcycling it one time, and so it's not really circularity per se. And you're right. There's some very disturbing research about microplastics and also toxicity of plastics in general. And I will double down on my call for we need to get rid of all the plastics we don't have to have in our lives, both for the fossil fuel extraction and life cycle impacts and climate impacts of that, but as well as for our human health and the health of ecosystems. So that's a long answer to say, yeah, plastics are tricky because they are harmful throughout their whole life cycle. And this issue of microplastics and what they're finding everywhere, I don't think it's just because it's in our clothing. It's in all around us, in the things we're also just using, but it's certainly part of the problem. So not an easy answer on that. Just that we need to use less plastics and reduce that.
Bert and Barb from Third Act, Arizona.
Well, Zen, what I wanted to ask you was in Tucson, they started this pilot project through the city council, one of the city council members, of taking all manner of plastics, and they collected them at one of the ward offices, and they're making them into plastic blocks, construction blocks, which then they're building planters and park benches and all manner of whatever you can use them for. And this company called Bifusion out of California is going to be opening up. The city said, oh, this is so great. People got all excited and we're turning in all their plastics rather than reducing. They go, oh, we got a place to dump all our crap, you know? So the bins were overflowing because one of the council members' ward dumping places was in our ward. So I'm with Sustainable Tucson, and so we've written letters to the city council saying, you know, yeah, that's great, but it's really not circularity, and there's some things we can do to stop it at the end, because if you got a bathtub running and it's overflowing, you don't just clean up and mop the stuff, you got to turn off the faucet, you know, you got to quit making more plastic. Well, anyway, so the research shows that with these blocks in the 108-degree Tucson heat, or however hot it's been this summer, it degrades. So then they have to coat it with protective stuff, which is toxic in and of itself. And they all think it's a great idea, and the city council's adopting it. And then they're going to put a plant, and now they're looking at doing it in Midtown around a lot of homes, where they're gonna, melt down the plastic and form it into these blocks. And we just had a fire in a facility up in Phoenix that's incinerating plastic, and it was horrible. I mean, you just read the story about it. And so now we're gonna do that around people with the smoke and all. I mean, it's just beyond belief, the things that people come up with that they think it's gonna stop the plastic flow that they don't know what to do with. And I mean, I don't know, people get into these false solutions like they think they've really got something going, and it's just making it worse. I don't know, what do you say to that? We're trying, but they see it as a real solution.
I totally sympathize. People want solutions so bad. They want easy solutions. They want to feel better about what we're doing to the planet. And yes, sometimes they're false solutions. And I absolutely, what you said about turning off the tap could not be more point on or spot on. We absolutely have to do that. And we don't ever want recycling to be an excuse to make stuff that we don't need. And we're pretty clear about that. So I want to laud you for your efforts to try to educate your decision makers. I think in the end, it's interesting to me that some of the most basic materials like glass and, well, I don't know, aluminum is very basic, but anyhow, are still the ones that make the most sense. And yeah, around here, well, anyhow, I won't go on and on. Yes, there is a lot of that going on. We have to stop making plastic. And not invent uses to make us feel better about what we're putting out there.
Adrienne.
Hey, thank you. In this little community where I live, one of the slides you had was about how to stop transferring the costs of the responsibility for the recycling to the individuals. Well, the town that I live in has gone exactly, I guess they've gone in reverse, because when I first moved here, it's about recycling. So they would recycle. We got a bin for rubbish and the bin for recycling. And then we got a notice from them that said, oh, well, because of the high cost of recycling to the city, we are going to have a subscription now where you will get a much smaller bin to put your recyclables at the curbside. And we want you to pay $144 a year to pay for that, when before it was part of our property taxes. And the pickups and everything. So I guess I want to get some input as to how can I address this and tackle this and see if I can figure out how to get them to change that mindset, because all they did was transfer the responsibility to us, the individuals, as opposed to them even taking it, or maybe figuring out ways that we can be part of the solution and review, like you said, reduce and reuse. So I'd like to get some ideas about how I can approach them about, and what kind of information, because they were taught cost is the reason they transferred that responsibility to us. So how do I combat that and create a case that can be compelling enough for them to listen to?
Well, a best practice when it comes to pricing services is to, and this may not be what you want to hear, but is to charge people for their trash and to base what you pay for on the size of your trash can. It's called pay as you throw or volume-based pricing. The idea being that people that really waste a little, don't waste much, shouldn't have to subsidize everybody that does, but then bundle in the cost of recycling and, depending on where you live, also composting into that price. So you don't pay extra for recycling and composting, you're paying for your trash service, and it goes up the more you trash. And that incentivizes people to use the recycling bin and the composting bin correctly, but to use it to reduce the amount of trash. So that's a best practice that has been adopted around the country, and really helps drive behavior, and also not charge people extra to do the right thing, like recycling and composting. And then usually cities, in order to keep the price down, would bid it out and have private or nonprofit haulers come, who can give us the lowest bundled price to provide that service. The promise of extended producer responsibility is that the brands, again, would pay for that system. So not your local government doesn't have to pay, but neither do you. You would just have to pay for your trash, not for your recycling. So those are all best practices that we promote when we work with local communities in Colorado. It helps if you live near in an urban area. It's harder when you live out in the rural areas. Then there's drop-off centers and other sort of economically viable mechanisms.
Okay. I mean, I kind of like that idea of paying for your trash. That might provoke a revolt around the whole the area, but I think somewhere we've got to stop something somewhere. I mean, and then to charge us for doing the right thing just doesn't seem like the right way to go about that.
Correct. It doesn't. And it's kind of backwards. You should pay for the trash, not for the recycling.
Right, exactly. So, okay. So what do I need to start? What do I need to get? Is there something I need to read that I can read, that I can start to work with them to say, I'm interested in this, and what can we do? What can the city do?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of what would be the best resource. Let's see, just so that you can contact us.
Okay.
My email is zan@ecocycle.org, and we can set you up with resources around best practices when it comes to pricing services, for example.
I'll put it in the chat just in case anyone else needs it.
Okay.
I'm putting it in there, and I've added a little bit more info.
Oh, great.
Awesome. Yeah,
And
I'm
Marti-
interested in that too, to
Thank you.
try to advance it in our state, specifically with composting. So that's great.
Thank
Well,
you.
thanks everybody. Wow, I didn't even have to come up with any questions because you all had such incredible questions. So hang on tight, because we're going to send you to 2 breakouts. I just want you to discuss a little bit further, but I have a couple highlights. First of all, Zan, you were amazing, amazing, amazing. And I learned so much, and my bet is that everybody else did as well. We've got many groups that are involved in recycling and upcycling, involved in Earth Gives, and they include Souls for Souls out of Nashville, Perennial in St. Louis, Let's Go Compost out of Scottsdale, Green Living Science out of Detroit, and of course, EcoCycle in Boulder. So definitely want to inspire you to consider giving and investing in a variety of organizations involved in Earth Gives Day 2023. We have 3 more sessions left that are power hours, and we're going to be excited to have you be a part of that. When you do give, okay, thanks, Luann. These are 3 of the more power hour sessions. So next week it's on regenerative ag. Then we've got Bill McKibben from Third Act on policy and driving climate solutions. And then of course, climate justice with the Climate Justice Alliance. And that's Mark and Monica who will be presenting that. Like I mentioned, if you do give to 2 or more nonprofits anytime between now and the 24th, you'll be entered to win a $700 package from Kaya Holistic. So big shout out to Kaya Holistic and Kathleen Mitchell, who was very generous in sharing this opportunity with our donors. And now I want you to take a moment to spend a little bit of time with Gabe and Hale to share what you're walking away with and what you might commit to do, because that's just as important as investing a little bit of money into the folks doing the work like EcoCycle. So I want to thank you for helping us blaze this trail as our first Power Hour attendees. And I wish you a great rest of your night. Thank you to Zan and the team at EcoCycle. Wow, really rock solid and amazing insights for tonight and sharing with us. So thanks again, and enjoy your conversation, and leave whenever you feel like it's time to go.